We have so many people joining us from all over, and thank you for being here this evening. My name is Jo Supernaw. I'm the Director of Academic Engagement for the Lifelong Learning team with Duke alumni. And I am so excited to welcome you here tonight for this one of many sessions with the Forever Learning Institute. If this is your first program with us and the Forever Learning Institute, this is a set of different programs that are interdisciplinary in nature, set to 4 different themes that we're exploring throughout the course of this semester. Each theme showcases Duke faculty and alumni experts in varying formats, from lectures to panels to TED Talk style events like the one you're going to see today. And we're looking at different aspects of the human experience, advancing health and wellness, social movements and change agents in America today. For our session this evening, we're going to be looking at the human experience, and most specifically, what is it that really makes our lives as humans different from other species that roam the planet, in particular, our emotions. And so what I'd love to do right now is introduce our moderator for the discussion this evening. We'll be joined by Associate Vice Provost and Dean of Students, Dr. John Blackshear. Through his education and his career, John is certainly no stranger to the complexity of emotions and the role that they play in our daily lives. Dr. Blackshear is a clinical psychologist by training, and since 2001, he has served in a wide range of essential support roles with Duke, including academic dean, clinical director of the Academic Resource Center, and a provider at CAPS, our counseling and psychological services space for students, just to name a few things. So I welcome Dr. John Blackshear. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all so very much for joining, and thank you, Jo, for that introduction. Once again, I'm John Blackshear. I am delighted to moderate this event this evening. No other time in my 50 years have I experienced such a confluence of various sort of strains all coming together in a moment that begs us to reevaluate and realign our values and really think through how we're going to move forward as a species together, looking at from everything from the social strife in the country, the political discord, to the relentless impact of the COVID pandemic. We have all been in one way, likely more impacted by this term in human history. And in my working with students, working with faculty, working with staff, as well as those in the community, one of the key components for well-being and the ability to endure and still find meaning and find purpose in the great storm of discord that we live in currently is finding those places where you experience joy, and finding those places where you experience happiness, and finding those places where you experience peace. And a critical component to all of that is the ability to regulate emotions. When we offer here at the university, meditation classes, or we offer opportunities for folks to learn how to regulate their emotional experiences, they're always, jam-packed with faculty, with students, with staff, everyone seeking in this moment to develop greater mastery of regulating their emotional states, because we know that those who regulate their emotional states well experience greater well-being. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panel to you, and I'm going to call on each panelist, and they're going to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Felipe de Brigard.
Hi, everyone. My name is Felipe de Brigard, and I am an associate professor in several departments, mainly in the Department of Philosophy and in the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. And I'm also secondary appointed in the Psychology and Neuroscience department. As I will be show you today, a lot of my research is extraordinarily interdisciplinary, and I use research coming from philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology to try to illuminate the relationship between memory and imagination. And today I'm going to talk specifically about the interaction between memory and imagination that has some effect on our emotions.
Thank you. And next we have Kibby McMahon, who will introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Kibby. I'm a PhD student in the clinical psychology program at Duke. I'm currently on an internship at Weill Cornell New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. I'm a native New Yorker, so I'm home. And I study lots of things. I study emotion regulation, empathy, and personality disorders. And I'll be talking today about how our own emotional experiences influences empathy, our ability to tell what other people are feeling.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we want to introduce our third panelist, Patty Van Capellen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Van Capellen. I am an assistant research professor in the Social Science Research Institute. I am a social psychologist by training. And as you will see, a lot of my research is around the psychology of religion and spirituality, as well as what we call positive psychology. So the study of human flourishing, what are the conditions to promote well-being, even during difficult times like the ones we live today. So looking forward to telling you more about my research in a moment.
Excellent. Thank you. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and have our first presenter begin to present his work, and Dr. Felipe de Brigard.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see my slides here? Okay, good. So it looks like they're working. All right, well, thank you so much. And I hope that you all can hear me well. So I did not start my research as an emotion researcher. I was actually a memory researcher, and I still consider myself primarily a memory researcher. But as I mentioned in the introduction, I did my PhD in both philosophy and also in neuroscience and psychology. And in the world of philosophy, philosophers tend to think of memory as being mainly a reproductive faculty. So this, for instance, is the definition of memory that came from Jacques Frederick Stout's Manual of Psychology in 1899. He argued that memory is the revival of ideas, that it is merely reproductive, and it does not involve transformation of what is revived in accordance with present conditions. Such revivals, he says, requires the objects of past experiences to be reinstated in the order and manner of their original occurrence. Nowadays, everyone in the psychology world, at least, will think that pretty much every sentence of that definition is false. However, many philosophers would still stick to something like a reproductive notion of memory, because they thought that there's a strict separation between memory and imagination. And in fact, some philosophers argue that misremember ought to be considered a malfunction of memory. During most of my graduate career and my postdoc, I was really interested in the fact that false and distorted memories, in general, they have an air of plausibility to them. It is very strange for people to false alarms to things that are very, very rare or very absurd. Even when people false alarm or have false memories about absurd things, they usually are consistent with the rest of their beliefs. And people in the literature talk about false memories being schema consistent or plausible or just driven. So at that point, I was doing a lot of sort of mathematical modeling, in which I was interested on understanding the underlying logic of our false memories and why is it that our false memories are somewhat systematic. And back then I was trying to capture, and this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll explain it in a second. I was trying to capture this underlying logic of false memories according to a model in which the prediction error is minimized by trying out hypotheses as to how exactly a scene could have been, given the previous knowledge and the present cue. So just to give you an example, this is a very famous experiment in false memories conducted in 1978, in which a car fails to stop in front of either a stop sign or a yield sign. Half of the participants see the stop sign and the other half see the yield sign. Importantly, at retrieval, participants are asked whether they remember having seen this car stop either at the stop sign or at the yield sign. Importantly, half of the questions were misinformation questions, namely people that have seen the stop sign receive the yield sign question and vice versa. And lo and behold, most of the people falsely recall having seen the stop sign when they have seen the yield sign, or vice versa. But now imagine for a second that instead of seeing those two, that there is a third condition. And that condition is a kangaroo crossing. Now, if you're from North Carolina, I'm not from North Carolina, but I did my PhD in North Carolina. If you're in North Carolina, the chances of seeing a crossing of kangaroos is really, really, really low. So would you imagine then that people are more likely to false alarm or less likely to false alarm to the kangaroo crossing? So if you're like the majority of the people that I asked this hypothetical question, they're going to say that they're very unlikely to false alarm to kangaroo crossing. The thought is, well, had it been in that corner, I would have seen it, right? And that's exactly what happened. This is the number of proportion of errors of stop and yield sign. Those are numerically, but not statistically significantly different. And it turns out that the kangaroo crossing, almost nobody false alarms to that. And indeed, there is a very nice computational model that actually helps you to sort of model this data. So the point of all of this is just to try to say, like, there is something kind of systematic and logic about the way in which people false alarm to information. And the hunch that I had at that time is that maybe our false memories are something like an unconscious or an involuntary counterfactual thought. And a counterfactual thought is a thought about an alternative way in which a past personal event could have occurred but didn't, right? So a lot of my work was actually try to discover whether our memory system is sensitive to counterfactual thoughts. That is to say, to imaginations about a way in which the past could have occurred but did not. And that led me to this very exciting literature about the relationship between episodic memory and future thinking that basically shows that the same brain regions that are engaged when we remember our episodic past are also engaged when we imagine our hypothetical future. And as I mentioned, a lot of my work has tried to show that that way of thinking about the past and the future, or what psychologists call mental time travel, is rather asymmetric. Because when we remember the past is what actually happened, while when we think about what might occur in the future, what we think about is always possibilities, which is sort of a cone of possibilities here. So a lot of my work has been to show that this system is not as asymmetric as once thought, that actually that very same system that enable us to imagine possibilities in the future, enable us also to imagine possibilities in our personal past. I have called in the past this episodic hypothetical thinking system, and I take the people thinking about future as working on this side of the cone of light, while my work and the work in my lab is sort of focused on this side of the cone of light. And if anyone is, I cannot summarize years of work on episodic counterfactual thinking, but if anyone is interested, we just recently published this sort of review piece in Current Directions of Psychological Science, along with my former student, Natasha Parikh, who just finished her postdoc at Harvard and just started or was about to start a faculty position at UNC. But what I wanted to tell you today in the second half of this short presentation is a very exciting result where actually emotion kicks in. So one of the findings that I sort of uncovered many years ago is the fact that with repetitive simulation of counterfactuals, certain things occur which are normal. So for instance, with the more you repeat a hypothetical simulation, the more detailed it gets. The more you repeat it, the more easy it gets to mentally simulate it again. But it turns out that the more you repeat it as episodic counterfactual thought, the less likely you think is that that event could have occurred. So the plausibility goes down. Why would that happen? Well, the explanation is relatively straightforward. When you imagine a counterfactual thought, what you're doing is sort of juxtaposing an actual event that did happen with an event that could have happened. And then you're sort of drawing your internal attention to try to see difference between what happened and what you imagine that could have happened. And the more you sort of pay attention and you spend time recognizing those differences, the more you start to think that many things would have had to happen differently in the past in order for this event to have occurred, right? Now, the interesting thing is that there is a population for which this effect does not occur. And these are individuals with generalized anxiety with and without depression. So in fact, in an epidemiological study conducted a few years ago, Neil Roese and collaborators studied a number of characteristics that were predictive of general distress in generalized anxiety with and without depression. And what they discovered is that there was this very interesting interaction between regret and repetitive thought, that what they call repetitive regret, thinking about the exact same regretful event over and over and over again. And it turns out that it was the best predictor of general distress in generalized anxiety disorder. Now, I got very interested in understanding the neural basis of this repetitive regret, because this is the effect with healthy adults. But when you do the exact same experiment with individuals with generalized anxiety, there is no such reduction in perceived plausibility. That is to say, no matter how many times they think that the counterfactual have occurred, they still think that it was equally plausible for it to have occurred. So what might be going on? So to try to uncover sort of this, the reality underlying this repetitive counterfactual rumination, we have conducted a number of different studies trying to sort of understand the difference in the process of memory reconsolidation between healthy controls and individuals with anxiety. And basically, what we have discovered is that individuals with generalized anxiety disorder there is something with them, with their memory, that upon reactivation, you cannot exercise this imaginative process that we call emotional reappraisal in such a way that they make these regretful counterfactuals feel less regretful. So the last little bit that I am going to mention is this one last experiment that I've been super excited, because the thought is, well, most of our counterfactual thoughts are about alternative better ways in which a past event could have occurred. When we imagine how something could have occurred better, we tend to generate regret, right? But what if we change people into thinking not about an alternative better way in which the event could have occurred, but an alternative worse way in which the event could have occurred, what it is called a downward counterfactual. So in this particular experiment, what we did is that we asked people to either just simply remember a memory or generate a counterfactual that was downward, that is to say, for them to imagine an alternative worse way in which a past negative event could have occurred. And we compared this with a very well-known technique for emotional reappraisal called temporal distancing. And what we discovered basically is, and then what we did is that we had a bunch of participants across different levels of anxiety. The higher this number, the more anxiety they have. And basically the main finding here is that when you repeated a counterfactual, a negative memory without engaging in any kind of imaginative manipulation, there is no change in arousal and pretty much no change in the amount of regret, a little bit increased regret, in fact. But if you ask participants to engage either in a downward counterfactual or temporal distancing, as their anxiety increases, then the difference in arousal also starts to decrease. And now the most important here is that actually asking individuals to engage in downward counterfactual work much better than temporal distancing in reducing levels of regret, even across trait anxiety levels, which suggests that maybe downward counterfactual thinking is a good imaginative strategy to modify changes in our negative autobiographical memories. So there is a lot, of course, that I could continue talking about the power of imagination and how we can leverage the power of imagination to improve our maladaptive memories. There is a lot of work we have been doing currently with nostalgia given COVID. And also we have a new project to study forgiveness in the context of emotional reappraisal. I'll be happy to talk about those during the Q&A. And this is my lab, one of the most recent pictures pre-COVID of the lab. Thanks to all the people that donate money to do research, and thanks to you. I think that Kivi, you should be next.
Yes, excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Brigard. And next, we are going to have joining us Kibi McMahon, and for her presentation. Here we are.
Hello, is this working? I'm setting this up. Good? Are we all good? Okay. just gonna trust that this is working. So hi again, I'm Kibby. I'm a PhD student in the clinical psychology program at Duke. And my whole mission is to help people who have difficulty connecting to others. So I try to figure out what gets in the way of connection and how to use skills, from psychotherapy to address those problems. So usually I've had to argue that social connection is really important for mental health, but I don't think I have to justify it this year anymore. So today I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been working on in grad school, understanding how the way we experience and deal with our own emotions influences empathy, or the way that we can tell what other people are feeling. So thinking about what helps us connect to others, the ability to tell what other people are feeling is super important. It's a skill. I say it's a skill. And some people are good at it and some people struggle with it. And a lot of people call the skill different things. It's sometimes called empathy, but in psychology, I'm going to refer to it as emotion perception. So that's a specific ability to perceive what other people's emotions are. So in experimental research, this ability is measured with tasks that have participants guess emotions from stimuli showing emotional expressions, like pictures of faces. So it's a classic Eckman task of being shown a bunch of photos of faces and having to guess what that person is feeling. So a lot of research shows that people with psychopathology tend to have emotion perception problems that even contribute to their problems in relationships and even mental health. That's how I got interested in this. And the specific kind of problem that we see a lot is called negative biases in emotion perception, which is related to a lot of disorders like personality disorders, anxiety, depression. And negative biases are defined as the tendency to attend to negative expressions in other people and ignore positive expressions. So people who have a negative bias tend to really pick up on when someone is mad at them or judgmental, but overlook when someone is being loving or kind. So I always think of this one client I had who had like a loving husband, great kids, and a job where she constantly got a positive feedback from people. But if someone even showed a hint of a negative emotion, like a frown or a pause when she was speaking, she would fixate on that and really pick up on that and ignore all the lovely things that people were expressing to her. So you can imagine that's really hard. So what's going on with these negative biases in emotion perception? So I was trying to figure out what causes these problems. Do some people just have a general tendency to view other people negatively, or what's going on here? And so I looked into the research and found that your own emotional state has a lot to do with it, how good you are at reading someone else's emotions. So if you're in a bad mood, you're quicker to pick up on other people's negative emotions and ignore positive ones. So you're worse at telling when people are happy and things like that. So this is the bias, this is the negative bias based on like how you're feeling, your own negative mood. So my previous research found that this negative bias happens within both people with different kinds of mental health problems, all kinds of disorders, and healthy people without psychopathology. So it's not really specific to any disorder or kind of person. It happens with a lot of people. And the more intense your emotional state, the more intense your distress or unhappiness, the more this happens, right? So it just might be that people with psychopathology like depression might be in bad moods more often. So they tend to have that lens more often than other people. So moving from identifying the problem to testing out a solution, my dissertation project looked at whether teaching people emotion regulation skills can help improve their ability to perceive other people's emotions accurately by reducing this bias. So I'm a yoga teacher, so I'm really biased in thinking that mindfulness is good for everything. So I looked at mindfulness, especially because in the research, mindfulness, and even just brief practices, like 15-minute breathing practices, have good effects on both empathy and emotion regulation processes. So I was like, score. So to make an intervention out of that for my study, I combined this training in mindful breathing skill with mobile phone reminders to help people practice the skill in daily life. So the idea is that this brief intervention can help people manage their intense emotions when they're actually interacting with their friends, coworkers, or partners, or whatever. So I'll give you an overview of the study design and introduce you to the main elements so you get the idea of how the intervention looks. So I had 80 adults with self-reported emotion dysregulation, problems managing their negative emotions. Started out with an intake session where we diagnose them and take baseline measures, including the main outcome measure, which is a motion perception bias task. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. And then they came back for a training session where all the participants were randomized to one of three conditions: mindful breathing, habituation, or control. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But basically, mindful breathing is when the mindful breathing skill, they learned that. Habituation is another emotion regulation intervention, but it's not a skill. It's not like someone can do something to do that. And control, they didn't have any emotion regulation training. So sad for those people. Then after that, during 1 week of a testing phase, everyone received text message prompts on their phone for 7 days that reminded them to report on their emotions, like how are they feeling in the moment. And when they were distressed, they were prompted to practice a skill if they learned one. And then at the end, they completed a final survey with the emotion perception bias task. So the main outcome measure, I keep saying the motion perception bias task, it's on the computer and it shows a picture of a face that's either showing a happy or angry emotion in different intensities. I was muted for some reason, sorry. So when the picture flashes on the screen and then someone has to guess whether that picture was happy or angry. So one measure of that task is out of all the angry faces that were shown to them, what % did they correctly guess was angry? So that's like how good you are at perceiving other people's negative emotions. Then the other one was the opposite, the percentage of happy faces they correctly guessed was happy. So, yeah, I used to actually worry that guessing emotions through, video or photos of faces on a computer screen didn't capture social interactions in real life, but now it's super relevant this past year. So, okay, so it's a fun little animation to show you. So during the training session, participants get either the mindful breathing intervention, habituation, or control, where they have no emotion regulation. So this just shows you what the mindful breathing condition looks like. So they come in, that's me. I teach them the mindful breathing skill, which is breathing in for a count of 4 and breathing out for a count of 7. So if you do that, actually, you could practice it now if you want. If you do that a couple times, it'll calm you down. Then they go to the computer task and then they hear a recording of a stressful event that they just had recently to help them stress out, not help them, make them stress out. Then they report their current distress, their negative emotions from 0 to 9, with 9 being the most distress. So they're hopefully kind of upset. And then they practice the mindful breathing skill. So they breathe in for 4, out for 7. And then as they do that, they have to report on their distress every few seconds. So when they calm down, feel better, then the computer will play a tone, just like that. Kind of like a Pavlov's dog classical conditioning of calming down. And then they go on to the emotion perception bias task. You see the face and you have to guess whether it's happy or angry. So that happens 3 times. They do 3 different stressors and they have to practice and they hear the tone and do the task 3 times. Habituation condition, we just had the stressors repeat over and over again until they calm down just out of boredom and time. But they didn't learn a skill. And the control condition, they just heard the stressor and went straight to do the emotion perception bias task, no tone, no training or anything. So they were the most unhappy. And then after that, to help people practice a skill in their daily lives, we use mobile phone prompts to send to remind them. So for 1 week, they're sent 6 text messages a day, asking their level of distress from a scale of 0 to 9. Several times a day. So if they report high distress, which is 4 and above, they, like this guy, pretty stressed out, they heard the tone. So hopefully the people in the mindful breathing condition associated that with, practicing the skill. So the feeling calming down, it's also a little reminder. Everyone else got the tone, but they didn't associate it with practicing a skill. And they're asked to distress again, just to make sure that to calm them down. So here are the results, and we tested whether the intervention worked both in the training session, like right away, and after 1 week. And here's the results from the training session. So the blue line is the mindful breathing condition. So over the 3 times they did it, they start to get better at perceiving positive emotions, and the control condition didn't. Opposite for the negative emotions, people in the mindful breathing condition got worse at perceiving angry faces than control. Whoa. And is it over time too? It wasn't right away. It took a couple of tries to do this. And the end of that 1 week, we had them do the task again. And there's no significant difference for positive emotions, but you could see there's a difference here. Not significant, but mindful breathing people were a little bit better. And then there was a significant difference with the negative emotions. So mindful breathing people were not as good as telling when people were angry than people in the control condition. So to sum it up, the takeaways for all of this, your emotions can determine the way you perceive other people's feelings. So even having this knowledge and awareness can be helpful. So if you're in one of those days where you think everyone's mad at you or upset with you, take a moment to notice how you're feeling, because that could influence the way you're seeing other people. And if you notice that you are kind of, not feeling great and you're about to talk to your wife, talk to your friends, using an emotion regulation skill like mindful breathing can help take away that negative bias. It could take away that lens. So you could really see what people are feeling accurately, right? It might skew you in the more positive emotions as a funny result of my study, but at least it'll be more balanced. You get to see when people are upset or when they're happy. So it worked. And also, I've found that regulating your emotions consistently can help you do this over time, can help improve your emotion perception and empathy skills over time. So maybe using apps or other mobile tracking tools to help you check in with your emotions and help you take a deep breath to calm down when you're feeling distressed can really help. So that's it. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, my lab, the Duke University Cognitive Behavioral Research and Therapy Program. My advisor is Zach Rosenthal. He's the one bearded guy on the left. And feel free to reach out, email me in my Duke email, or check out my podcast called Little Help for Our Friends. So of course, I'm really passionate about helping people connect to others. So it's a podcast about helping loved ones of people with mental health issues. So that's it. And thank you so much for listening. I'll turn this over to the next presenter, who's Patty.
Yes, Patty Van Kaplan will be our next presenter. Thank you very much, Kibby. Patty, you're up.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this event. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening and to share a little bit more about my research on emotions. So the title of my presentation is Emotions from Feeling Good to Feeling Meaningful. And as a researcher in psychology, I have been fascinated by the study of not one, but two complex ideas. Emotions, which have already been well introduced tonight, they are these brief, multi-system responses to some change in the way that people interpret their current circumstances. So emotions change your body, your face, your voice, what we feel up to do, and of course, how we subjectively feel in the moment. And then the second idea that I'm working on is religion. I'm trying to take a scientific approach to understand when people turn to religion and how engaging with religion can change someone's behaviors and ideas. So emotions are clearly an integral part of the religious experience and the religious practice. And I want to make the points today that emotions are highly prevalent in religion. They're triggered in many different ways, and they are consequential. Now, when I started doing this research, I was very surprised to notice that the kind of emotions that are being studied are mostly negative. There are these emotions that don't feel very good: fear, sadness, guilt. Research showed that religious beliefs and practices helped people cope or wrestle with these negative emotions, but also that sometimes religious beliefs and practices are responsible for instilling these negative emotions. This led Bertrand Russell in 1927 to conclude that the basis for religion isn't faith, it's fear. This focus on negative emotions was not specific to the study of religion. In fact, all of psychology research showed this negative bias. Psychologists pioneering the research on emotions only included a single clearly positive emotion in their taxonomy of emotions, and that was joy. And joy was used as an umbrella term for any feel-good emotions. So why so little focus on positive emotions? There are at least two reasons. One is that we as humans are not as good differentiating between positive emotions compared to differentiating between negative emotions. So on one hand, we often say, I'm happy, without specifying a more particular flavor of happiness. On the other hand, we would never confound fear with sadness. So just overall, we're better at doing these distinctions between negative emotions than between positive emotions. A second reason is that bad is stronger than good on so many levels. Negative experiences are more salient, they're more impactful, more memorable than positive experiences. So it's not surprising that negative emotions had received more attention from psychologists than positive emotions. But in the 1990s, researchers started studying positive emotions and uncovering a whole new side of the emotional picture. Consider all these different positive emotions, in addition to the most commonly studied one, joy. When we register that something good is happening in our environment, this can take on many different flavors. We can see beauty, kindness, success, excellence. Researchers like Barbara Fredrickson have shown that all positive emotions broaden our scope of awareness in the moment. When we feel them, we literally start seeing the big picture. And this functions over time to build our resources for survival. With the accrual of positive emotions, we're becoming better equipped next time a problem arises. We're building important resources. Coming back to the study of religion, what my and others' research has recently shown is that these positive emotions are also prevalent in religion. Overall, people who identify as religious and who practice a religion tend to report feeling more positive emotions than people who don't. In addition, more intense religious and spiritual or mystical experiences are also often accompanied by intense positive emotions. And not just the umbrella positive emotion of joy, but also more specific emotions about which we're now gaining much more knowledge. Self-transcendent positive emotions, such as gratitude, awe, admiration, love. These self-transcendent emotions push people to see beyond their self-boundaries, to consider the larger scheme of things. An example of a non-self-transcendent and positive emotion would be pride, for example. So religion triggers these positive emotions in many different ways. And here I focus more particularly on how religious practices provide opportunities for positive emotional experiences. Here are some findings. The monumental architecture of worship places can elicit awe and wonder. The practice of prayer and church attendance increases feelings of gratitude over time. We found that the practice of meditation, whether it is a formal practice, sitting down, doing a 30-minute session, or a more informal practice of making small shifts in attention throughout the day, both increase the experience of positive emotions in the moment as well as in daily life. And more recently, I have run several studies showing that the very physical postures people adopt while worshiping can elicit positive emotions, with more expansive and oriented upward postures being related to more positive emotions. Importantly, these emotions are consequential. Here are 3 examples from my own research. Positive emotions are part of the explanation for why religious people show greater well-being. In one study, we surveyed hundreds of people who had just attended a Sunday church service. We asked about their experience at church and their level of well-being, how satisfied they are with their life, and how optimistic they are. We found that how much they had experienced positive emotions during the church service was the strongest predictor of their well-being, more so than how much meaning they derived from the church service or how much connected they felt to others while attending church. Positive emotions were really the active ingredient promoting well-being following church service. Second, self-transcendent positive emotions promote perceived meaning in life and spirituality. In a series of studies, and here I'm showing one example, participants who were assigned to experience different kinds of emotions, we had participants experience some self-transcendent emotions such as admiration, elevation, or awe, and also experience or some participants were assigned to experience amusement, a non-self-transcendent positive emotion, or no emotion in particular. And then right after experiencing these emotions, we measure their level of spirituality as well as their level of meaning in life. And we find that participants who experience self-transcendent positive emotion report higher spirituality and higher perceived meaning in life than participants who experienced amusement or no emotion. So this research suggests that the motivation to believe does not only stem from fear, but can also stem from self-transcendence. And finally, positive emotions make us stick to our practices. When they're experienced during religious and spiritual practices, they motivate, energize, and further sustain over time these costly practices. And they're costly in terms of time, energy, and money. So they're hard to maintain over time. What we find is that how much people experience positive emotions during these practices really predict whether they're going to continue doing them. For example, we found that among novice meditators, how much they experience positive emotions during their initial introduction to meditation predicted how much they're going to continue meditating in the next 3 weeks. Participants who experienced more positive emotions on average than others meditated on average 11 more minutes per week in the next 21 days. In fact, in another study, the extent to which people experienced positive emotions when introduced to meditation was the sole psychological predictor of keeping meditation as a regular habit more than a year later. And of course, pleasant activities are repeated simply because they are pleasant. But we outlined a theory explaining how positive emotions create these non-conscious and increasing motives for the activities that promote their experience. And we find that the role of positive emotions for behavior or practice maintenance extends beyond religious practice. It extends to different health behaviors, such as exercising, for example. How much you enjoy and experience positive emotions during exercise will predict how likely you are to continue exercising. In closing, I hope I've demonstrated to you that emotions come in an amazing variety, both on the negative end of the spectrum, of course, but also on the positive end. That religious beliefs and practices, promote in many different ways the experience of consequential positive emotions, such as awe, gratitude, love, and admiration. So, do you need to start going to a place of worship? Is that the implicit conclusion of this presentation? Well, I would argue that religion provides a nice package of beliefs, behaviors, relationships, traditions that facilitate the experience of positive emotions. And the context of religion helped me in my research to highlight the benefits of positive emotions for well-being, meaning, and behavior maintenance. But these emotions are not religious per se. You can find them in everyday life. They're available to you along with their benefits, even outside of religion. Thank you very much for your attention. Here is my website if you would like to know more about the kind of research I do at Duke. And here is some image attribution that I used tonight. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all for your presentations. And we're going to move right along into the discussion phase, and we have several questions that have come through. I think the first one we'll pose to Felipe, but others can chime in as they wish. But Felipe, what are the real world implications of your work to better sort of help our audience understand the science and theories, right? How does one even create counterfactual events?
So part of the motivation for this was, my little foray into clinical psychology. I was really interested in trying to figure out what was the relationship between counterfactual thinking and memory, and why is it that for some individuals, in particular those with generalized anxiety disorder, this effect of plausibility and repetition in counterfactual just doesn't occur. And the reason was, I thought, it has to do because when you reactivate a memory, the memory becomes liable and prone to modification, and then you can affect it through emotion regulation. This is a lot of people argue that this is kind of like the underlying mechanism that underlies cognitive behavioral therapy and a number of different kinds of therapies, right? So the thought was, well, if you only have 45 minutes with your therapist, you want to maximize your time, right? So there is a number of cognitive behavioral therapies or emotion regulation strategies applying cognitive behavioral therapy that might work. But could we find one that works the best, right? That was the thought. So what we have been doing is comparing counterfactual thinking, in particular, the creation of worse ways in which a negative event could have occurred. So suppose that you have an autobiographical memory of something bad that happens to you. So like, oh man, like I miss that particular deadline. I should have waken up. And then what you do is that you start imagining what would have happened had you woken up earlier and then not miss that particular deadline. But wait, there are a lot of other possible things that could have occurred that could have been much worse. Imagine what would have happened if you had a heart attack that morning, or if instead of missing that deadline, you missed something altogether worse than what you actually did. That's the kind of counterfactual that we ask people, that we invite people to think about. And it turns out that when people think about these downward counterfactuals, worse ways in which it can happen, then that notion of regret later on actually is even further reduced than with other emotional strategies, techniques. So yeah, that's a real world application of that you can actually employ downward counterfactual thinking to help you emotional regulate during memory reactivation.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Brigard. Kibby McMahon, have you done or do you know of any research similar to yours, if you've not done yourself, where the strategies, techniques that you describe and utilize have been studied on adolescents and or children in helping the regulation of emotion?
Yeah, actually, one of my studies in grad school was it was a program called Yoga for Youth, and we went into 4 different public schools in North Carolina and taught them mindfulness and Kundalini yoga, which is a lot of breathing exercises and stuff, and did measures of emotion regulation before and after the program, and it worked. It helped them learn new strategies to help calm down and manage their emotions, which was great because they started the program just, like, I don't know about yoga, I don't know about mindfulness, but then afterwards they were like, oh, it helped me when I got mad at my sister to just take a deep breath and walk out of the room. And so it's like, okay, we'll take it. So I'm not usually a person who studies adolescents or children. I study more adults, but that was my one little foray into that population. It was great. And there's a lot of research on that, especially programs that were implemented in schools, right? So like in their actual environment, their schools or home is super important. So yeah, a lot of cool stuff there.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Dr. Van Capellen, could you speak to whether or not there are any studies on the impact of individuals' emotional health with the loss of opportunities to be in worship gathering places due to the limits of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, so I saw that question in the chat and I was excited to see it. We are actually planning a study on that just now. So we will be comparing whether attending in person is like creates a different experience than attending virtual services, because there are other opportunities to worship right now. People can attend the virtual services on their computer, but obviously it creates a very different kind of experience. So what past research is showing is that what is important for well-being with attending church service is that you create, social connections. You feel connected to others. You can share their emotions, and that amplifies your emotions. Could be amplifying negative emotions, but also amplifying positive emotions. You're also creating shared meaning, shared values. And this is very important. And one particular driving factor of this is that there is synchrony. So you are doing the same motions, you're feeling the same emotions. And the synchrony aspect is very important to create social closeness and powerful emotions and meaning and values that you feel like, yes, these are common core values and this is important. So all of these aspects are super important, and we are curious to know how that unfolds in a virtual service. So we will start recruiting soon. We need to compare people doing virtual services to in-person services. So we need at least some in-person services to happen to do this research.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we've talked quite a bit about the relationship to other and how many of these practices help to build compassion. And y'all speak a little bit about what you've learned about self-compassion in your work and in relation to whether it is, your work with counterfactual events, your work with meditation, and your work with the study of religion and emotions. And that's kind of a round robin, so go for it.
Who first?
Oh, I don't really have thought much about self-compassion, to be completely honest. Some of my work relates a little bit with forgiveness, but not so much necessarily about the self, but to others. So we currently actually have a new research project in which we think of forgiveness as an emotion regulation process as well. Basically, the thought is that when you forgive someone, and perhaps this would affect you as well, you don't forget the event that occurred, right? Like forgetting the event that occurred does not seem to necessarily be synonymous with forgiveness. In fact, it seems as though you need to be able to remember what happened. But of course, when you remember what happened, it doesn't hurt as much if you have forgiven. So the thought is that forgiveness involves a kind of emotional reappraisal. And currently the project that we have actually I am super excited about it, looks at forgiveness in the context of emotional reappraisal with individuals who have suffered from political violence. So we have a really large cohort of victims of guerrilla violence in Colombia, which is where I'm from. And we're actually doing interesting research and trying to understand the process of forgiveness in relation to emotional reappraisal. So even though I haven't worked directly with self-compassion, I can relate it a little bit with the idea of forgiveness as emotional reappraisal, similar to the role that downward counterfactual plays, in which I was just speaking, but importantly different, because in this particular case, it involves the emotional and sometimes moral wrongdoing of a third party.
In terms of my work, I love compassion meditation. I do it a lot in my clinical work, but I didn't do it in this study because I wanted a skill that was super fast. So I wanted a skill that you could just practice within a couple seconds. And compassion meditation, at least the way I've learned it, it takes a while. You have to visualize, or you really cultivate the feeling of compassion. Maybe think about others and extend it. So it takes a little longer. So I know that Tanya Singer is a really great empathy researcher in Germany who has a lot of research on this and how specifically compassion meditation can enhance empathy. And compassion is really important because compassion is different than empathy. Empathy has some elements of taking in someone's emotion, being able to tell what it is and responding to it. Compassion is like a feeling about someone else, right? It's extending the sympathy or warm feelings about someone else in distress. So a lot of what Dr. Singer's research was on was that learning how to do compassion meditation could actually help you not burn out and take in someone's distress as much. So you don't have empathy burnout. So you're just like extending love to someone instead of just taking in all their distress, which, as we talked about, like taking in distress might create some problems there. So that's just some cool stuff that I know about, but I really want to do more of this kind of research in the future.
Yeah, in my research, it's interesting to notice that the whole line of work on self-compassion is coming more from like a secular meditation angle. So there hasn't been a lot of discussion between religion or what are the kind of religious practices that may promote self-compassion, even though there are some. But so it is pretty distinct right now. And there is a lot of research on religion and compassion for others or empathy for others and helping others. And there the picture is pretty complicated. And that's another part of my work that I do where I study the darker side of religion, showing that yes, on average, religious people tend to help others more than non-religious people, but there's a limit to that helping behavior. They don't help everyone. So if the person to help is someone who will threaten traditional religious values or who is very different from the religious person, then the help does not extend to that person. So empathy or pro-social behavior is limited in a certain way. And so what we're trying to study right now is how can we reduce this bias in pro-social behavior? How can we reduce this bias to better predict practices that may promote helping everyone independently of who they are? Because that is supposed to be the message from most religions, from every religion, in fact.
Well, all right, I know we're at time. I wanted to, it seems like a pretty important question. And so I want to ask this one and just ask you to give your brief response to them, and then we will turn it back over to Joe. But a recent article in the New York Times showed that increased prevalence of negative news versus positive news, right? That there's an increase. To what extent do you think all of these negative stories affect our emotions and therefore our perceptions of the world and each other? And if you could give us something super skinny on, what you would say to even counter those things, or how would we even be able to advise on even considering establishing more positive emotion in a world where we are being bombarded with more negative than positive news?
So my 2 cents, that's a tricky question. My 2 cents is don't read that many news. I think that probably the best strategy for me is focus on local goodness. I think that focus on where you can actually exercise change. And I would imagine that my co-panelists here would probably agree. Like you want to focus on where you can exercise change. And sometimes just looking around, you can see much more goodness than when you look through the internet. So stop the doom scrolling and just look through the window.
Beautiful. I agree. I agree. I mean, keeping in mind probably that news sources sell more newspapers if they have more negative news, right? So there's, kind of understanding the context where it's that information is coming from. And there's an emotion regulation strategy, or I don't know, an intervention called stimulus control. So even before you feel an emotion, if you just don't come in contact with a thing that brings up an emotion, will help you feel better. So, you know, if I don't want to eat cookies, I don't have it in my house. If I don't want to feel sad, I don't look at the news that much. So use stimulus control.
Beautiful. Stimulus control. Excellent. And Dr. Van Capellen.
Yeah, well, I think because of the fact that bad is stronger than good, you need a lot more positive news to offset the cost of the negative news. That is the problem. But also because bad is stronger than good, we want to first attend to the negative news because we need to know what is going on and make sure we're safe. So there is kind of this bias, like, yeah, we need to know what are the threats in our environment, kind of this primal need. And if everything is okay, then we can start attending to the more positive stuff. So I think it is understandable that there's more negative news than positive, but it makes it even more challenging for us to put the work in to not be totally downed by this negative news, because what it will do is make us more think about our immediate environment, what, you know, are we safe, and not really open us to like the broader view and the bigger picture. And it is unfortunate, but it is understandable, I think.
Well, Dr. Van Capellen, thank you so very much for sharing your work and your wisdom with us. Kibby McMahon, we really appreciate you. Thank you for sharing your work and wisdom. And Dr. Felipe de Brigard, thank you so very much for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you to all of the attendees who came out this evening, sharing your questions. Truly, truly appreciate you and hope that what you heard here in this hour will inspire you to continue forth in your own way toward the positive and the good. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Everyone for joining us. I just put in the chat the link to our YouTube channel. This session, as well as all of the other Forever Learning Institute sessions, are posted to the Duke Alumni Lifelong Learning YouTube channel for your consumption. Our next event is going to be March 30th with Assistant Professor Carolyn Barnes discussing her book, State of Empowerment, which looks at government-funded after-school programs as part of our America Today course. I want to say a double thank you, Dr. John Blackshear, amazing moderator. Thank you so much for your time. All three of our speakers, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights about our emotions. And we're so excited for all the connections that were made this evening, and we hope you keep learning with Duke. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.